Hi, I'm Oliver and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. I thought it was about time on this series to tackle the legendary King Crimson, a band who has been labelled prog since the late 60s, early 70s, but ever since then their music has been like a coursing river, branching off into the wetlands and fjords of art rock, classically influenced compositions, folk eccentricities, and the blistering intensity of live improvised work. So yes, the music of King Crimson is overwhelmingly progressive, but perhaps not in the way you think. And the reason I say this is because I don't want anybody to bypass King Crimson thinking, oh, it's just 70s prog, I don't really like 70s prog. There is so much more to this band to like. And I think there's something here for everybody. So please make sure you dive in and check out some of these records, regardless of your preconceived notions of what progressive music might be. And when I say their music, I really mean him. So King Crimson is one of the most ephemeral rock groups in terms of formations. The lineup of King Crimson has changed more times than a witty comparison about lineups. Oh, I'm so tired. The non-variable at the centre of King Crimson is Mr. Robert Fripp, a songwriter and guitarist from Wimborne in Dorset who has worked with the likes of Peter Gabriel, Brian Eno, David Bowie, Andy Summers. Born in 1946, Fripp has created a weighty legacy, creating some of the most original and beautiful music that I've ever heard. And whether you appreciate that triple-tracked guitar work on David Bowie's Heroes or the Frippatronic wizardry of his collaborations with Brian Eno, like Evening Star, an album like that, or even the genius of King Crimson, there is a lot to admire in his work. And because of Fripp being the non-variable in this lineup, I know I risk turning this guide into a Robert Fripp guide, which I really do not want to do, because one of the most important things about King Crimson is that each time there's a new lineup, each musician is integral to the sound of that record and that release. So I'm going to make sure as much as I can that I balance out interviews with some of the other artists other than Robert Fripp, because I don't want this to be a Fripp guide. I'm not going to be talking about Robert Fripp's solo works or his other collaborations. This is about King Crimson, the band. He can famously be difficult to work with. He has a very grouchy persona that follows him around. I think some of that sounds like it's warranted, but it does sound like he's also softened of late slightly. If you check out on YouTube, I'll put the link in the description. He appeared on a game show called All-Star Mr. and Mrs. in the UK with his wife Toya Wilcox, answering questions, being blindfolded. It was all quite strange, but actually it was quite heartwarming because he seemed like he was genuinely happy, and perhaps he has softened slightly with age, and perhaps that persona of Fripp being such a difficult person to work with has maybe been inflated over the years. Although part of that irritated old man persona is his refusal to work with streaming services, and as such it'll be very difficult for any of you to find King Crimson music unless you are going to pay for it, which is fine. It's his art, and he's had many issues in the past with record labels and things like that. Something I'm not really going to get into in this guide because I think it just takes away from the music and there's more interesting things to talk about. But yeah, if you want to listen to King Crimson, you're probably going to have to pay for it, which I think you should do, because I think there's some amazing music in this discography that I think everybody should at least listen to once. So I hope that you will do that and consider doing that. I mean, there are some tracks online that have been put up by him himself, but he's very hot on copyright, so good luck trying to find full record streams on YouTube or things like that. We'll start with a little Fripp quote before I continue. It's easy to forget that the act of music is a transforming and transformative experience, and music really can change our lives. And onward. So before we get to the actual formation of King Crimson, I have to talk about a strange little group called Giles, and Fripp. Peter and Michael Giles, two brothers from Bournemouth, wanted to start a group. They were looking for a keyboardist and a singer. So what they did is they met Robert Fripp, who was a guitarist who couldn't sing and couldn't really play the keyboards, and nevertheless they took him on to form this band. Square peg, round hole, guys. Forming in 1967, the trio released The Cheerful Insanity of Giles, and Fripp, which is cheerfully insane, that's for sure. It's got like a humour that's akin to Monty Python. It has a folky whimsy to it. It's very late 60s. There's a track called The Ballad of Rodney Toady, which is an absolute treat. Don't go in expecting to hear too much of a proto-King Crimson sound in this work, although there are some lovely little nuances in Fripp's guitar playing which will obviously be fleshed out in the incarnations of King Crimson. I say this with one caveat. The Bronsbury tapes were released in 2002, which were actually recorded in 1968, and they're a lovely little time capsule of this trio. One of the tracks is a track called I Talk to the Wind, which famously is on the debut record of King Crimson, and this is a slightly straighter, version of that track, but it still has some of that mystical magic that makes its way onto the version that we know as a King Crimson track. So that's definitely worth listening for the comparison. It's just this strange jazzy freak folk stuff really, and it's quite charming. And I quite like it, but it's often forgot about, understandably, because of how seismic the next group would be. As the musical collective began to change, Peter Sinfield was brought on, who is a lyricist, but he was very instrumental to this first iteration of King Crimson, and also Fripp rather craftily replaced Greg Lake as the singer and bassist instead of Peter Giles, which sounds like quite a cutthroat move, which is something that Fripp seems to do time and time again. But I don't know how bothered Peter actually was, because I don't think he was really enjoying the process of what the band was becoming anyway, although in the past he has called it one of Fripp's cute political moves. To be fair, he does end up getting involved with King Crimson again. It's just sad he missed out on one of the most groundbreaking records of the 20th century. One of Sinfield's first contributions was whipping out his notebook and finding a new name for this musical collective. Anything was better than Giles, and Fripp. King Crimson had an arrogance to it. A euphemism for Satan, perhaps, although some people say it alludes to Beelzebub, the prince of demons, or perhaps even etymologically is connected to the idea of the bloody reign of a monarch. I mean, it doesn't matter too much, but anyway, this new collective called King Crimson started properly rehearsing at the end of 1968 and the beginning of 1969. Fripp has talked about these rehearsals in interviews. They would hole up in this house, they'd rehearse from 6 p.m. till 10 p.m, and there was a lot of improvisational work going on, as well as some ideas which were being fleshed out. The first 9 days were shaking hands and getting to know each other. The second 9 to 10 days, something very different took place. They were intense sessions by the sound of it, very small space, very high volumes. There was very much a sense of this is a group which will speak with its own voice, without any compromise whatsoever. This sound got a trial in the form of a support slot at the Rolling Stones gig at Hyde Park in April of 1969, a very famous gig, which apparently blew much of the crowd away at this new band, what they sounded like. They sounded like nothing else. I think with a renewed confidence, they continued to work on their material, record it, and in October of 1969, Island Records put out the debut King Crimson record, In the Court of the Crimson King. Next year, this record will be 50 years old, which is very difficult to comprehend, because if you listen to it now, it still sounds fresh. Parts of these records still sound cutting edge. I mean, this record really did blow the doors wide open at the end of the 60s, introducing a generation of music lovers to a whole new form of musical expression. You can immediately identify in this music what Fripp was talking about, with hearing a band that wasn't going to compromise on its sound, that it had something to say and it was going to do it in a unique way. According to Sinfield, the songwriting and rehearsal process was purposefully reaching for something unique. If it was simple, it had to be scrapped because it had to sound different. It had to explore things that other records had not explored before. They wanted to create a kaleidoscopic world of music, one with the crunchy blues guitar, one with sweeping melodrama, pastoral calm, medieval anachronisms, and this record has it all. Greg Lake and Fripp have been friends for years, and Lake has often reflected on how their friendship helped them craft this unusual record. By the time King Crimson was formed, we were like two peas in a pod, like mirrors. He knew exactly what I knew, and I knew exactly what he knew. That was one very strange component of King Crimson. The other was that Ian MacDonald had never been in a rock band before. He came from the military, from a military brass band. That was a bit peculiar. King Crimson was not an everyday sort of band. Yeah, you can say that again, Greg. It's no wonder that In the Court of the Crimson King is so expressive, taking influence from such a wide base of musical ideas. Opening track 21st Century Schizoid Man, I mean, it's such a great track. Most of you will have heard it, if not for being sampled on Kanye West's track Power, but it has this killer riff from Fripp, distorted vocals from Greg Lake, and that blustery saxophone tone from Ian MacDonald. Switching between 4/4 and 6/8 time signatures, this is a formidable introduction to the band. I mean, what a way to introduce your music to the world. And there's this great free time outro at the end, which is just a complete cacophony that attacks you. You have no idea what's going to be coming next on this record. Sinfield's otherworldly lyrics and Michael Giles's commanding drum beats really do bring this entire track together, and I just cannot think of a better way to open a record. And it's not a blueprint for the rest of the album. That's part of what's so impressive about all of this. The second track, I Talk to the Wind, which was the the Giles and Fripp track, it has much more of a dynamic weight, a dynamic quality to it, much more of that magic, mystical quality that the straighter version was perhaps missing. Fripp's subtle harmonics in the chorus coalesce with that gentle ride cymbal, Lake's croons, McDonald's mixture of flute and clarinet, which really adds to that folky, almost medieval texture of the record. I mean, it's a gorgeous track. Sat at the centre of the record is Epitaph. It's the sweeping melodrama of the record, which is bolstered by liberal use of the mellotron, a 70s prog rock staple. McDonald has said in the past that this is his favourite track on the album, and I can see why. I mean, it's probably one of Greg Lake's best vocal performances, especially as the instrumentation swells underneath him as he sings, "Yes, I fear tomorrow I'll be crying." So it's a tear-wrenching moment. Is tear-wrenching even a word? I think it's no, it's heart-wrenching, isn't it? Oh, I don't care. Whatever. Moonchild really steps out there. It's a 12-minute track that starts as a folky ballad with the mellotron sounds, that great panned ride cymbal part, but descends into a free improvisation section, which is smothered by the sound of vibraphone. The duality of this track is reflected in the subtitling. You have the dream and the illusion really does elevate this whole record from what could end up being a fairly standard prog rock record to this evocative, expressive type of music. I think it's a really amazing moment on this already fantastic record. The final track, The Court of the Crimson King, is very much Ian McDonald's track. He composed it, and that central chorus with the mellotron sound, that's him, and that's what makes this track completely. Elsewhere, the fluttering flutes on the first verse are his input once again. Just a beautiful finale to this record. There really was no one else like King Crimson, and In the Court of the Crimson King absolutely proved that. There was a zeitgeist of the times which was particularly powerful, outside the sense of fashion or swinging London. It was a remarkable creative download which came through rock music, popular music, in ways which I'm still considering. It's a goddamn journey, influencing countless musicians ever since it was released. And it's a cornerstone of 20th century music. It bridges that quite perceived wide gap between rock, classical composition and jazz, making people think actually some of these can be put together and done in a compelling way which doesn't feel jarring. Ian McDonald was really the composer of this first records, and after they released this record and started to tour, the cracks started to appear, the creative differences, that old classic thing when you're in a band, that started to happen between him and Fripp. Fripp wanted to take things in a wilder direction than Court, whereas McDonald wanted to take the more romantic passages and build out there. So we had two completely contrasting ideas for where King Crimson was going to go next. So with this, the tumultuous history of King Crimson lineups begins, and that really is a big part of this band. So Sinfield and Fripp began to work on concepts for the next record, and they decided to hire the Giles brothers as their rhythm section. So hi Peter, welcome back, and sorry about all of that. Keith Tippett was also brought on, a brilliant jazz pianist who I think is a good marker for where Fripp wanted to go with the band later on down the line. Including him in the lineup means things are going to get more experimental. Greg Lake had actually left the band now to kick off the legendary Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but he did return to provide vocals on the next record, the sophomore record released in 1970, In the Wake of Poseidon. Weirdly, Elton John almost ended up as a vocalist on this record, and I would love to go to some parallel universe just to hear what In the Wake of Poseidon would have sounded like with Elton's vocals instead of Greg Lake's. A very interesting thought. In the Wake of Poseidon is a good record. There's a lot to like. It doesn't manage to hit the dizzying heights of its predecessor, but that doesn't mean there's a lot of things to enjoy about this record. It does, however, stay very close to the blueprint of In the Court of the Crimson King, which I think is often why it's considered particularly inferior, because it just doesn't match it, but it also gets far too close. Pictures of a City is like a more brassy 21st century schizoid man. It has a great strut, courtesy of the Michael Giles percussion. It has that really nice saxophone motif from Mel Collins, but you can't help but feel it's an attempt to capture the magic of schizoid, which it doesn't quite manage to do. And especially when you listen to this discography chronologically, that becomes very apparent. You know, if you've never heard 21st Century Schizoid Man, you probably wouldn't make the connection, but I mean, who hasn't? So I think that becomes quite noticeable right from the off. A track like In the Wake of Poseidon is mellotron soaked, and it's performed by Fripp, and it very much sounds like a version of Epitaph, although again, sadly, not quite as good. Cat Food is without a doubt one of the most interesting tracks on the record. It's a bit of a throwback to the Giles and Fripp stuff with the sense of humour. It's got a snappy backline, the bizarro lyrical quality of the track. Lady Yellow Stamper with a fillet in the hamper, dying to finish the course, goodies for the table with a fable on the label, drowning in miracle sauce. Don't think I am that rude if I tell you that it's cat food, not even fit for a horse. The Devil's Nightmare is fittingly an instrumental hallucinatory nightmare. You have this marching band sound drowned out by discordant mellotron and piano. In the end, it's an unfortunate case of it being like Icarus straying too close to the sun, being in the court of the Crimson King, and having its wings burnt off. But I don't think that it's a bad record. I think it's a good record, and by any other prog band standards, a very, very good one. It's just, unfortunately, it follows up In the Court of the Crimson King, which is a masterpiece. So, unfortunately, it's never going to quite match up. With that, we arrive at third record, Lizard, also released in 1970. And let's just begin with a quote from Robert Fripp to sell this album to you. Overall, the album is unlistenable. Oh. Ignore him. What does he know? I think Lizard's brilliant. I mean, okay, it's not a brilliant record, but it's a solid record. Unshackled from the genius of the debut record, this is a stormy 42 minutes of madness, basically. It's much jazzier than the previous two albums, and it's not as meticulously crafted as something like In the Court of the Crimson King, but with that, there's like an unrefined quality and excitement to what's being made here. I don't think this is a bad album at all. With Greg Lake now fully engrossed in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Gordon Haskell joined the band full-time as a bassist and vocalist. He was on a couple of the tracks on In the Wake of Poseidon. Mel Collins stuck around to do woodwind, Andy McCulloch replaced Michael Giles as percussionist, and Peter Sinfield took on a bit of a larger relationship within the band in terms of the instrumental, so he started playing on the VCS3 synthesizer as well as continuing to write those lyrics. It's certainly a divisive record, one that Haskell himself particularly did not like. We got down to rehearsing Lizard and the drummer Andy McCulloch was in tears. Fripp used to bully him unmercifully. He bullied us all. I don't go for that though, so where Andy would cry, I would just laugh. At the end of one song, Indoor Games, I just burst out laughing. You can hear it on the album. They thought it was really freaky that I'd understood the lyrics and my part, but the truth of the matter is, it was a lousy song. The lyrics were ludicrous, my singing was atrocious, so I just burst out laughing. And they thought it was wonderful. So that warped laugh at the end of Indoor Games is because Haskell thought the song was shit. Please remember that when you listen to it, because it definitely adds something. Also, Fripp does sound pretty awful here, doesn't he? He does not come off very well in that anecdote at all. I mean, who said it was easy to work with geniuses, but still. By far the greatest thing about this record is the 23-minute title track, which happens to be the closer. Now there is this thing that happens with a lot of the King Crimson records where the final track is the longest track, and in many ways it's almost as if the whole record is building up to that moment, and it certainly feels like that on this record. It's a track that makes no attempt whatsoever at forging an obvious path, because it starts off with this lilting balladry, but all of a sudden we go into this jazz improvisation which takes over the whole track and probably tested a fair few King Crimson fans back at the beginning of the 70s. It's a track that really shows a classical inspiration too. There's a grandiose feeling to the instrumentation on this track. Also, a lack of Fripp's guitar mastery adds to that feeling. What I love is the way the artwork converges with the music itself. It's medieval influence, and it has that dark, brooding feeling, but it also has a chipper aesthetic that we associate with the darkness of medieval literature and films. It reminds me of something like Ben Wheatley's A Field in England or Benjamin Meyer's novel The Gallows Pole, where it manages to be humorous but also retain that very dark aesthetic of these medieval ideas. It's not all like this, because Indoor Games feels like it's cut from the same cloth as Cat Food from Poseidon, and maybe the reason that Haskell didn't like the track at all. Don't forget to check this one out. Just because it's divisive doesn't mean there aren't things to like about it. In 1971, the orchestral influence on Lizard is taken even further on the new record, Islands. Poseidon, Lizard and Islands all cover quite different ground, and though there are some common factors, there are probably more points of divergence than convergence. More creative differences meant that most of the personnel from the previous record aren't here on this album. This is the last appearance for Peter Sinfield, but he is on this record. We have Keith Tippett and Mel Collins again, providing piano and woodwind respectively. This time Boz Burrell is on vocal duties for one of the King Crimson records that definitely slips through the cracks, and I can understand why. Islands experiments with a string ensemble, and it kind of removes the need for the mellotron, which was such a big proponent on the previous records, and it gives a mellower, lusher vibe to this record because it's the real thing, it's the actual strings, and that adds more of an authenticity, I guess, to the sound and to that grandiose feeling that was coming through on the album Lizard. Take the track Sailor's Tale, for example, which has a lively percussive groove, which could, if it had been played a different way or produced in a different way, sounded like 21st Century Schizoid Man, that same intensity. But Fripp and Co, made the decision to foreground the saxophone and the guitar instead. So instead of this being a really intense driving force of the track, the percussive groove just adds colour. And that's definitely a different approach to some of the stuff we've seen previously throughout this early King Crimson discography. It actually complements the album art nicely, as Lizard did, but this time with the image of the Trifid Nebula. All the miles of space that are created between instruments on islands make for a celestial music experience. Just listen to how the string-led romanticism on Sailor's Tale gets swallowed by the bassy cacophony at the end of the track, led by Fripp's electric guitar wailing. Much of Formentera Lady, the opening track, is carried by the flute performance of Mel Collins, and the track never really builds, even though you might expect it to build from their earlier records. It doesn't. Instead, it ends on this achingly high soprano from guest vocalist Paulina Lucas. There are actually parts of tracks from Giles, and Fripp in this record, so the keen-eared of you will probably notice that as you listen. As with the last record, one of the best pieces on this entire record is the final one, the title track, Islands. It's a very jazzy piece, it's led by trumpet, and it has this wonderful string-backed finale. It soars, and it's probably one of my favourite moments in the entire King Crimson catalogue. So, if you were thinking of missing this record out, please at least listen to this track, because it might convince you to check out the rest of the album too. So good. In the following year of 1972, Earthbound was released, which is a famously terrible audio quality live recording. It basically sounds like a bootleg. It has been slightly cleaned up now with the 30th anniversary edition, so maybe take a look, but don't expect high definition audio or anything, because you definitely won't get that. And so with this record, we end the first period of King Crimson. Everyone had different ideas of where to take the band, including Robert Fripp, so everyone just went their separate ways and did their own thing, including Peter Sinfield, who had been a big part of King Crimson from the beginning, along with Fripp. If Islands was anything to go by, Fripp wanted to take his fascination for improvisation and musical exploration even further. And so what we actually end up getting is probably the best record since In the Court of the Crimson King, and it's my personal favourite King Crimson record, 1973's Larks, Tongues in Aspic. Searching for his next collection of collaborators to basically rebuild the band around the ideas that he had for it, he met with Bill Bruford, who was the drummer of Yes, incredible drummer. If you haven't listened to Closer to the Edge and Fragile, you need to go and do that, because they're amazing records, and his drumming on those records is it's just so good. So they actually met, Fripp went round Bruford's house and they had a little jam together to see how they would work together. We went into my music room and Robert said, "If I played this, what would you play?" Apparently I must have done the right thing, because eventually he suggested that we do some more. Well, he did more than that in the end, didn't he, Bill? He actually managed to work with you for an extended period of time. Shock horror, Robert Fripp managed to do it. I'm joking, sort of. But Bruford actually ends up being the drummer for King Crimson all the way up till 1996. So they must have had a really solid working relationship, especially if Fripp is so famously difficult to work with. And boy, what a player he is, an absolutely brilliant percussionist. One of my favourite drummers around. You need to check out some live performances on YouTube if you haven't seen him in action. I feel like the modern prog god Steven Wilson's own anecdote of listening to Larks, Tongues in Aspic for the first time is a really good way of introducing how great this record is. I was in my mid-teens and I'd borrowed it from a friend. My first reaction was that it was one of the most dynamic records you could ever hear. Within the first 5 minutes, you've been through every extreme of volume. There's a sense that this version of King Crimson gelled together the best. They had a slick working relationship, they had a dynamic intensity, and also this improvisational connection that sometimes feels as if it borders on telepathy. There's a Crimson way of doing things, you know. And it's a fairly intense emotional relationship in the band. It's exhilarating to be part of and could produce magical music that will change people. The lineup of Larks Tongues is completed by Jamie Muir, a percussionist alongside Bruford, and the reason that they went for two percussionists is that Fripp felt that Bruford was sometimes too straight of a player, although I'm not sure where he's getting that from. But together they form a formidable duo that's such a big part of this version of Crimson. We also have John Wetton on vocals and bass guitar, and David Cross playing mellotron and violin. Larks, Tongues in Aspic takes the belligerence of 21st Century Schizoid Man, the exploration from an album like Lizard or Islands, and through these 5 musicians manages to construct a masterpiece. Stephen Wilson isn't wrong when he says the first 5 minutes of this record really draw you in with the dynamic intensity. First track, Larks, Tongues and Aspic Part 1, it builds on Jamie Muir's tuned percussion, and it verges on the relaxing until the tense violin from David Cross comes in, and then all of a sudden you get this ramped up distortion from Fripp's guitar, and you're kind of like, whoa, that kind of came out of nowhere. At that point you're prepared for it to kick off, and it does, with a riff that pretty much rivals 21st Century Schizoid Man. I know I keep coming back to that track, but it is just such a staple. It feels like you always have to return to talking about that track when you're discussing Crimson. It's an incredible track, one that manages to be heavy and beautiful in a matter of minutes, in the opening minutes of this album, and the whole album is like that. And I think the kookiness of the songwriting moves it away from the progsphere, that's not even a word, progosphere, something like that anyway. But because probably no Peter Sinfield, his lyrics were probably keeping it more proggy than anything else. He's now gone. So we're really moving much further away from the idea of progressive rock. Yes, it's progressive in sound, but not prog in terms of that early 70s label. Larks Tongues Part 1 is actually part of a 5-track suite, and it continues on the Part 2, which is right at the end of this record. And then we have Part 3, Part 4 and Part 5 later on in the discography of King Crimson. But Part 2 is less exploratory, it's straighter and it's heavier, so it's really satisfying. You get that duality on the record, which begins with an idea and ends with the same idea, and that really helps to give this record a brilliant focus, a real focused approach. Speaking of Part 2, it still has that brilliant dynamic quality and Muir's percussive nuances that are just delicious. It's just straighter though, which I think is a really strong way of ending a record. Wedged between these tracks, you have pieces like Book of Saturday with Fripp's reversed guitar part, which feels like a precursor to his Frippatronics explorations of the late 70s. Easy Money begins with this wonderful strut and a doomed bell, and it's once again Jamie Muir's percussion that adds so much to this track and this record in general. This track kind of reminds me of what Tom Waits was doing in the 80s, actually. The essence of it was that we were still 5 musicians carrying with them their qualities and gifts and still trying to find a way of welding it all together into one distinct personality. Muir unfortunately made the decision to leave the band after Larks, which I do think is a big shame because he added so much to this record, but to be honest, the quartet went on and made such a brilliant album anyway. They managed to make lightning strike twice, somehow, just in a different way. So in 1974, we have Starless and Bible Black. Though Larks is a record that's loved by many, the band at the time felt fatigued by those recording sessions. They felt that they hadn't really managed to capture the fiery energy that they felt they had when they were playing live. So as such, this record was a really meticulously produced one in that most of the recordings, bar 2, were recorded live on stage at gigs, and then they had the claps and the audience sound scrubbed out in post-production. And that way they hoped they would capture the intensity of their live performances and the improvisational pockets they managed to land in during those performances. On paper, it might sound like a recipe for a much less defined record because you have improvisational tracks and things like that, but no. The live tracks sit alongside cuts like The Great Deceiver and Lament, which were done in the studio, and you really can't tell. I mean, I think if you did a blind audio test on someone, they wouldn't be able to tell which of these tracks were done in the studio and which of them weren't. So bravo to that. It's another record which is so gripping because of its variation of sounds, its exploration of different ideas. For the most part, Crimson always managed to strike a balance between all these different things so releases don't feel pieced together. But I feel like on this trio of records, Larks, Starless and the next record, Red, they did it the best. The Great Deceiver is the opening track. It's knotty and complex, and this is one of the studio tracks, so it's not improvised. Bruford himself called these recording sessions excruciatingly, teeth-pullingly difficult music making. So fun then. Testament to the quartet then, that it never feels laboured to the listener. That cacophonous opening riff never feels incongruous with that intense middle section, swapping between time signatures and Wetton's very commanding vocal presence. The pieces recorded on stage, like We'll Let You Know, flow with such a precision that you think these must have been meticulously crafted. There is no way that this was just improvised, but it was. That is an improvised piece, completely improvised apparently. The mince it is too, but it has a darkness that's mostly eked out through Fripp's distorted guitar, snaking its way through those rim taps and that bass line. The masterful build to that explosive finale on final track Fracture, it feels like it would take a number of times to get right in the studio, but somehow this band managed to capture it live on stage that once. And I just think that's amazing. When you listen to this record, you need to try and remember that because it does add another dimension to how formidable these musicians were as a unit. We removed the audience because that was the only way we could get the atmosphere we were after. Before Red, we could never recreate that power in the studio. It just wouldn't happen. You're in a sterile environment, whereas on stage you've got all that air and people and you've got energy. But by the time we got to Red, we did it. Ah yes, Red, the 7th King Crimson record, released in 1974, and it's another masterpiece, but genuinely, I'm not just using the word masterpiece now to describe everything, but it just is. You know, I said that the band was getting steadily louder and louder. Well, they definitely hit a peak on Red, so much so that during live performances, Cross's violin was getting drowned out and he was getting really pissed off with it. So much so that the band just all decided to get rid of him and continue as a trio. A very in-your-face record. Apparently Fripp wasn't really sure where the band was going at this point and let himself take a bit of a back seat, allowing Wetton and Bruford to lead the recordings on this record because they apparently very much knew what they wanted to make, and it resulted in probably the most beefed up King Crimson record we ever got. At this stage it's hard to remember the whimsy on a record like Lizard, released only a few years before, but look how far this band has come since then. First track, Red, is visceral. It's an instrumental track which really presents the performance abilities of these three core players. Gone are the improvised passages on previous records, and there's a real sense of directness straight away on this first track, and that continues throughout the album. Fallen Angel begins to sound whimsical in that old Crimson fashion, but there's a real sense of paranoia that undercuts that whole idea, mostly from that undertracked horn passage, but also Bruford's machine gun snare fills. One More Red Nightmare has Bruford smacking what sounds like an upturned trash can instead of a cymbal, and then you have the twisting of Fripp and Wetton's riffs. Providence is a bit of a return to the spacey improvisations of previous records, but it retains the same tension and directness of the rest of the record, which is why it doesn't sound the same. It feels as if it has that undercurrent of energy that's ready to explode without actually exploding, and there's a real power in the songwriting and the performance because of that. Finale Starless feels like an actual epitaph. There's a melancholy, a mournful feeling throughout, until of course the trio really pull that melancholy out from beneath your feet with this face-melting section. There's a 13/8 time signature used at one point, and then just jumping back into that incredible riff to finish things off. I mean, that riff is... When I say it felt like an epitaph, it's because it kind of was. Just before Red was released, Fripp had already decided once again that King Crimson was going to be no more. It was no longer an appropriate form of education. I saw what it was to be a human being. I saw what real freedom as a human being is. At this time, King Crimson was poised to be just about the most successful rock band in Europe. So how could I throw away my career to live in a house with 100 loonies in Sherborne in very cramped conditions? I knew I had to do that. Sherborne House was this place that Fripp went to discover himself, I suppose. If he truly felt that music was a continuous form of education and that King Crimson was a stagnant form of education that he was no longer getting anything out of, Sherborne House seemed to be his next step. At Sherborne House they ran courses under the name the International Academy for Continuous Education, where Fripp studied to do a couple of different courses. I don't want to go too far into this because it is a King Crimson guide and it's not a Robert Fripp guide, but it's interesting to see what happened to Robert Fripp's solo music after he attended this course at Sherborne House. It was more cerebral, more ambient. He collaborated with Brian Eno. Everything became a lot more experimental, more eclectic perhaps, and maybe he really did just need this continuous education course or whatever it was to kickstart his and reinvigorate his musical creativity. And obviously that's what he needed to continue King Crimson. So good, I'm glad he did it. There is also a live album that was released in '75 called USA, which has some great renditions of tracks like Aspic Part 2, Easy Money and Schizoid Man. It's a worthy document of this excellent lineup. After this bout of rediscovery and various collaborations, Fripp decided he wanted to put a new band together, but perhaps that band could be called King Crimson. Same name, completely different musical style. So that's what he did. Getting Bruford back on board for percussion, he also managed to secure Adrian Belew and Tony Levin, two very talented musicians. Belew had been part of Talking Heads, worked with Bowie, Zappa. Tony Levin had worked with Peter Gabriel. These were musicians that were really tapped into the important artists of the late 70s, early 80s. Levin also made a name for himself for his performances on a Chapman stick, which is one of these fat bad boys. He also went on to perform on some of the Steven Wilson records, and also he was part of Liquid Tension Experiment. Such a good fusion band or fusion project. Please go and listen to that if you've never heard it before. So this quartet, another bloody solid quartet, worked together to create 1981's Discipline, a record which is basically a new wave art rock record, something you might not have expected if you've ever listened to earlier King Crimson records. You probably listen to it and go, is this the same band? I mean, this is the thing. Welcome to this ephemeral world of King Crimson. It's something many people have commented on in the past, but despite being stylistically different from some of the other King Crimson records, there is an undercurrent feeling that this record is a King Crimson record, and it's the idea that perhaps King Crimson is more of a philosophy or an approach to making music than a specific set of musical rules. And I find that a really attractive way of looking at this band, particularly because it's like a collective. So many different musicians have been involved in it, and there are so many different time periods of King Crimson offering different things for its listeners. So I think that's a good way of looking at this band as a philosophy rather than a project with very specific musical values. Discipline manages to harness progressive rock, art rock, experimentation with this new wave sound emerging out of the early 80s and craft another King Crimson masterpiece. That word again, masterpiece, because it is. What it is, however, I think the last King Crimson masterpiece. True, they made some great records after this, but I don't think they ever hit the heights, hit the creative peak of this record and records like Red, Larks, Tongues in Aspic, In the Court of the Crimson King. That opening track, Elephant Talk, must have been a shock to Crimson fans on a first listen, because Fripp and Belou's guitar sounds make something more akin to a Talking Heads track than King Crimson, and indeed the vocal performance of Adrian Belew on this track specifically could genuinely be David Byrne. I mean, it's a dead ringer. Musically, the band is grooving on this track. There's a funkiness to it, but they don't lose the eccentricity of being a King Crimson track, and they continue to incorporate non-Western ideas into their music successfully, I think. Belou's Byrne impression doesn't stick for the entire record, and I'm glad, because I think it would get quite tiring. It works on the first track, but I think throughout the entire record, no, I don't think so. So thankfully, when you reach the track Frame by Frame, he has a lovely soaring vocal line which works so well underneath that tom-heavy Bruford percussive line and those dual guitars that are inspired by gamelan. If you listen closely, you can hear that one note is dropped by one of the guitarists, both playing the same guitar line, so everything begins to go more and more out of sync. It's a wonderful little detail in an album full of details, in a discography full of details. The dreamy Matter Kudasai is a lovely ballad with Belou's echo slide guitar line stealing the show well and truly. A track like Thelahun Gunji is the perfect example of the band retaining that grooving dynamic and sound that they've got from the first track, but also there's this undercurrent of tension which is left over from Red. So, I mean, particularly there's an undercurrent of tension because of the audio recording put over the top of this track. So Adrian Belew basically ran into a gang when he was in London. They were recording this record, and he came back to recount his experiences, which Fripp was recording, and he didn't know that. So you've got this highly strung sound coming from Belew because he's so terrified of what's just happened, which then gets added in to the track. Is that exploitation? I don't know. Fripp probably didn't care, let's be honest. The Sheltering Sky showcases cascading digital sounds that are now part of Fripp & Co.'s arsenal, no longer having to rely on string sections or mellotron, and just getting a bit more up to date with what was happening in the technology of music. And you can definitely hear that progression throughout the King Crimson discography, from the first record to the final record in 2003. God damn. A lot of people say start with Court. I say start with Discipline. Hot off the success of Discipline, in 1982 they released Beat, very much a similar sound to what they had just created. I have to mention at this point what the lyricism of Belew did to the band. It gave it a new dimension. I think his lyricism is not talked about enough, and I think it's a very important part of this iteration of King Crimson. Hotel room homesickness on a fresh blue bed, and the longest ever phone call home. No sleep, no sleep, no sleep, no sleep, no sleep. And no mad video machine to eat time. It moves Crimson further away from the lofty whimsy of their earlier prog influences, and Belew was a real wordsmith, which is a nice segue into talking about Beat, a record with a through-line concept. The poets of the Beat generation. Musically, Beat both feels more accessible and also has greater moments of experimentation than its previous record, Discipline. I don't think it's quite as successful or as polished as Discipline, but it's still a good record. With that same lineup from Discipline, I know Fripp managed to work with them again. Hallelujah! That was really cringe. They managed to continue grooving together, creating interweaving textures, Bruford swapping between acoustic and electronic percussion. Belew's vocal performance on opening track Neil and Jack and Me is excellent. It's got this expressive vocal growl to it, and then there's these moments that sound like Sting, which in fact could be a negative if you don't like Sting, but you know, hey, I like him, so I see that as a positive. And although the group still kind of has that new wave sound, the musicianship, the intricacy of the performances moves it away from any new wave peers and into its own field entirely. Neurotica is aptly named, as it sounds like the musical definition of neuroticism, or certainly giving you the feeling of being neurotic anyway. You have Bruford's scatty swung ride rhythms, you have a mash of guitars, a blues quick delivery, and that barn burner of a finale. Tell me Beat's a bad record and then listen to this track, because I don't really see how those two things work together. Requiem, the final track, returns King Crimson to more improvisational waters, but it still sounds very connected to the interweaving, grooving sound, the experimentalism of this record. It doesn't sound like the improvisation of King Crimson of old. And it's quite an odd record. It's an oddity, but I'm not saying that as a negative. I think odd is good. Rather typically, the band started to feel tensions rising as they recorded this record, resulting in another hiatus, surprise, surprise. But before that happened, we get the final record of this trilogy of King Crimson records, Three of a Perfect Pair, released in 1984. So I do like a lot of the tracks on this record, but I think in the end it suffers from a lack of clear identity. I don't know if it was whether Fripp wasn't sure where the band was going and wanted to hedge his bets, but the first half of the record sounds closer to the discipline and beat material, and the second half is far more improvisational. It sounds much more like a Robert Fripp solo record. And those two things just don't go together. And I think it's a shame, because after Discipline and Beat, I think this trilogy deserved having a very powerful finale. And Three of a Perfect Pair doesn't really manage to deliver that. In the end, it feels like a collection of B-sides or musical ideas, but not a fully formed record. The first track, the title track, can be traced back to Discipline. It sounds bold. Bruford's grooves are frenetic and they really propel the track. Sleepless has the energy of Beat and Discipline tracks, but it feels less inspired, I suppose. Not quite as invigorated. The band just sound a little bit tired on these tracks, and that might be me projecting that onto the recordings, but I do feel like you can hear some of that coming through. As we reach the second half, tracks like New Ages and Industry create some interesting atmospheres and moods, but they just do not work as the second half of this record. They don't connect, and as such this record just sort of falls flat, unfortunately. The final track is the third part of Larks' Tongues in Aspic, and it almost makes up for the inconsistencies of the rest of the record. It feels like a spiritual sequel to those first two tracks that we heard all the way back in 1973, and it also sounds like the up-to-date King Crimson band, so that's no mean feat, being able to connect these two different periods of King Crimson with this one track. And I think it's just a really brilliant piece of music. Doesn't still quite make up for how flat Three of a Perfect Pair feels, but you know, if you're not going to listen to this record, at least check out the final track. And with that, Fripp was unsatisfied. We got no new King Crimson records for the rest of the 80s and a lot of the 90s for that matter. In fact, the next release after Three of a Perfect Pair is 1994's Vroom EP, which is a precursor to the next full-length record. This record features the lineup of the previous King Crimson incarnation, plus two extra people, Trey Gunn, who is a bassist and guitarist, and Pat Mastalotto, who is a percussionist and a drummer. What makes this new incarnation of Crimson so interesting is that it's a new approach to making music, a double trio. You now have two bassists and two drummers, which really ups the melodic and rhythmic possibilities and complexities that you can make with this music, and they absolutely do that with this material. Apparently the idea originally came from Fripp, but Bruford has said in the past that he was really pushing Fripp to go in this kind of direction. Working with another drummer is great fun because you immediately have a rhythmic counterpoint or counterfoil, and I think the best stuff I did with that, in a way, was with Pat Mastalotto around King Crimson's Thrack. I'm not going to talk too much about the Vroom EP because really it's a proto-release getting ready for Thrack, released in 1995. This is a full length we have to talk about. For me, Thrack is the sign of a band refusing to stick to a singular sound or being tied down to a singular musical idea. After the Discipline years, it would have made no sense to bring back that sound in the mid-90s. It would have been anachronistic, and therefore the band moved forward with new ideas. Another part of the ever-moving, ever-progressing King Crimson machine. Instead we get a beefed-up double trio, we get razor-sharp dual riffs, we get a lot of depth from the dual bass players, and then we get this imposing percussive duo led by Mastalotto and Bruford. This sound isn't far off what Fripp and co were doing in the mid-70s. It's much more rocked up than the dancier music they were making on Discipline, Beat, three of a perfect pair. And it's a delight to hear this six-piece work together on a track like Coda Marine 745, with percussive hits syncing and unlocking, very much like the guitars did on a record like Discipline. Fripp and Ballou weaving chords and crying melodic expressions together. Ballou's vocals on a track like Dinosaur, juxtaposed by the spiky guitar riff. It sounds a bit like a 70s track resurrected in the 90s, and it is a good track, although it's a little bit of a cringy line, "I'm a dinosaur, somebody's digging up my bones." Not a massive fan of that. The title track, Thrack, is a better example of what this double trio was capable of. You have a real cacophony here, I really do mean that, with atonal chords, a chromatic bass lines, and battling percussive hits. The best thing you can do with this record is get two massive speakers and sit right in the middle of the sweet spot and listen. Because of the way that the record's been panned, it genuinely sounds as if these two different trios are battling for supremacy. It's great, and it really does elevate this record if you listen to it in that fashion. You know, you could use headphones, but I think, you know, having the physicality of two big speakers is the best way to do it. So if you have the opportunity to do that, I'd definitely recommend it. Hearing two instruments polyrhythmically interweave, syncing together and then unsyncing again is great, but hearing two sets of musicians doing that together, elsewhere, a track like People sounds like rock fusion. That funky bass line doesn't sound far and away from the kind of stuff Victor Wooten was doing with Vital Tech Tones. A really strong record, and over 20 years after that groundbreaking debut record, this band are still doing things that other bands aren't doing. So, great. There's a whole glut of live albums in this period, like Thrack Attack, live in Mexico City. There was also a lot of 70s and 80s gigs that were then resurfaced and repackaged and released around this time. Here's where the history of King Crimson gets a little bit weird. So Bruford had decided he could no longer work with Fripp in the same capacity anymore. They've worked together for a long time, and they probably pissed each other off by the sounds of it. So this new period of King Crimson had Fripp and a number of musicians going away and doing what was called ProjeKcts. So different pockets of musicians were setting up under the King Crimson name or under the ProjeKcts name and improvising, doing gigs, a couple of different studio records, and part of it was trying to find the sound of the next King Crimson iteration. It seems a bit strange, but it really does make you realise how much of a collective King Crimson really is, and that pushes forward into, you know, 2017 and 2018 with what Robert Fripp is now doing with the King Crimson live gigs, which are whole hosts of musicians standing on stage. There's almost no room for everybody to stand on them. Celebrating some of the earlier output of King Crimson, but also pushing forward with new ideas as well. If you have time to delve in, there are lots of records here, lots of live releases. There's like 5 or 6 projects, I think, and ProjeKcts released Space Groove in 1998, which is worth a listen, definitely. I don't have time to talk about it all because I feel like this would be a 2-hour-long guide if I did. A lot of it's quite dense, very heavily improvised, but interesting nonetheless. So if you do want to extensively work your way through Robert Fripp, King Crimson, then it's certainly worth a listen. But we have to move on to the next King Crimson record, 2000's The Construction of Light, featuring, of course, Robert Fripp, Adrian Belew, Pat Mastelotto, and Trey Gunn. It's a real dud, I've got to be honest. It's the only true dud in the King Crimson discography. You would hope that after all of the ProjeKcts performances, trying to find the new sound of King Crimson, something genuinely interesting would have come out of that. And unfortunately, the record that we got is a very confused, muddy piece of work. It's like an amalgam of a number of different Crimson eras without ever pushing forward, and that's a real disappointment because they've always been so good at doing that. This feels like a real step backwards, this record, in so many ways, and they don't manage to do any of these eras much justice through the music on this LP. Opening track Prozac Blues has a satisfying blues stomp to it, and Mastelotto's electronic drums are punchy, but they do lack a depth. I feel like Bruford is missing here, and in fact, maybe it's not even Bruford, it's the fact that the electronic drums are being used, because Mastelotto's a good drummer. It's just, I think, a real shame that they decided to use electronic drums on this record, because at many parts it just lacks the atmosphere of acoustic drums, and the technology wasn't there yet in 2000 to make electronic drums sound as good as they do now. I mean, now they just sound like real drums because they're just triggered recordings of real drums being hit. But yeah, it does limit this record, I think. And let's not even talk about Belew's Tom Waits impression on this track. Not good. The most successful part of the record is the long-awaited part 4 of Larks' Tongues in Aspic, but even this falters because of the overuse of MIDI sounds, electronic drums. It all just doesn't sound very urgent. It's very plodding. It's such a shame. It's just not a very good record. If any of you out there are fans of this record, please let me know. Let me know in the comments section why you like this record, because I'd like to get into it, because generally I feel like most people align with my opinion on this one, that The Construction of Light just isn't good, and not indicative of a band with such a varied, brilliant discography. It does stick out like a sore thumb. So Crimson toured with Tool in 2001, and it's difficult to ignore the potential influence of Tool on the final King Crimson record, 2003's The Power to Believe. The lineup stays the same as the construction of Light, but the music is markedly different, thankfully. Taking on an almost contemporary progressive metal vibe on this record, the band throw down on a track like Level 5, which has IDM-esque skittering in the percussion, it has atonal riffs, a hell of a lot of weight, a lot of dramatic tension. It's also supposedly the final part of Larks' Tongues in Aspic, although I believe that certain other band members that were involved with the previous versions don't agree with that. But hey, it's Fripp's band, let's be honest. The 8-minute Electric is quite a fricative track. It has that underlying tension. A lot of the melodic sounds of yore have really been moved on from on The Power to Believe. The band aren't interested in those lilting moments we often got on earlier King Crimson releases. Instead, we get a record that's quite combative. It is quite combative. It sounds contemporary. It doesn't sound like a group of musicians trying to do something that other bands are doing better. They managed to hold their own on this. This doesn't seem like the same band that made the construction of Light whatsoever. There are still some things I can't get on board with this record, one of them being Baloo's auto-tune vocals that appear prominently throughout. That feels like a misstep to me, just because I don't think it adds anything to the music. It doesn't make the music feel more aggressive. I think that might have been the intention, or maybe to dehumanize the sound more. I think it just ends up feeling like a bit of a misstep, to be honest. And despite not loving parts of this record and thinking this record is good as opposed to excellent, I think it's great to hear this band continuing to reinvent themselves, do things they've never done before, do things other people haven't done before, as they did in 1969 and throughout the rest of the King Crimson discography. And that's the final King Crimson studio record, which means we've reached the end of this guide. Ever since the final 2003 record, Fripp's been on stage touring King Crimson with a massive lineup of people, which has been interchangeable, as it always has been. And he seems to be loving playing versions of old King Crimson work live. I don't think he's got any plans to do any more King Crimson records. However, I think I might take that with a pinch of salt, because he has changed his mind on things many a time. So who knows, in a few years' time, we may get another King Crimson record. But if we end up finishing on The Power to Believe, then fine, that's not a bad record to go on. And we've got just a wealth of incredible records to listen to, some of which I hope you will check out now you've seen this guide. And a final quote from the person who has ended up being the central focus of this video. For me, art is the capacity to re-experience one's innocence. Craft is how you get to that point. Maturity in a musician would be the point at which one is innocent at will. At that point, the relationship between the music and the musician is direct and reliable. Food for thought there. Thank you so much for watching this guide to King Crimson. A great band, so much to talk about. I'm sure all of you will have different favourite King Crimson records. Let me know in the comment section what they are, what your opinions of this band are, what your experiences of this band have been. Please join me on the Deep Cuts Discord tomorrow at 10 PM, where we will be listening to King Crimson's Red. Great record. Come and join us for that one. As ever, thank you so much. Thank you to all my patrons who without this would not be a thing, as I always say. Thank you for all of you who continue to watch and support the channel. I'll be back next week. See you then.